Could you talk a little bit about where you were educated? I think you even mentioned that you went to Fort Bragg, or no, somewhere in the United States for training.
Oh, that was purely from a parachuting point of view. Well, some officers did. For example, we had two officers in Lisburn who went to Fort Bragg, which was the Army Special Forces school. But that training was largely based on Vietnam, and it was a very different field, but it was part of the syllabus for senior officers who were going to be involved in PSYOPs. That wasn't my role. My role was really to try and bring Northern Ireland knowledge into a structure that had already been approved as a syllabus for PSYOPs anywhere in the world. So the idea is that PSYOPs principles would go into any war theatre. But the key thing is that to make it work, it had to be relevant to the feelings of the target audience. So what we were doing with Americans in Vietnam, most of it would be totally and utterly irrelevant to the conflict in Northern Ireland. And so I was really bringing into the PSYOPs team the Irish dimension, as it were, in terms of history, emotion, symbols, sounds, all of those things. And then, together we were coming up then with a working model.
But you also attended, PSYOPs training programs, internal army ones.
Oh yes, yeah. Indeed, yeah.
And is there anything that you can talk about?
No, because I think that, you see, again, that's live, and my idea is not to criticise that, because I believe that is part of warfare. But what I don't want to do is to share techniques publicly where there are probably soldiers out somewhere in the world using that's going to put them at risk. That's not what I want to do. So it's one thing talking about Northern Ireland and that concept, but getting down to the mechanics of it, because it's then not difficult to identify that when it happens and to actually weaken the strength of your case on the ground.
This is a very different use of psychology, and I think a lot of people wouldn't be aware that, this knowledge exists and that people study psychology for these kind of purposes.
I think that's true, but you have to be careful, because we did do lots of things that had a positive psychological effect. Like, for example, we ran youth clubs, we ran community relations. I was the Army's Father Christmas, going around schools and hospitals at Christmas. We actually provided funds for projects. We took kids away from the really bad areas of Northern Ireland, from opposite sides of the fence, Catholic and Protestant together. We took them away to the mountains for camping. Now that is positive psychology, because what you're doing is you're creating a relationship, A, with the Army, and saying the Army is not really people who are around beating you over the head, but we also allow Catholic and Protestant youngsters to come together for probably the first time in their lives, because we had segregated education in Northern Ireland. And I remember the Parachute Regiment built a club on what was then the peace line between the Shankill and the Falls Road. And there were two entrances. One was coming in from the Protestant side, one was coming in from the Catholic side. And they ran a disco there. And teenagers came in there and there was no problem, and they got on fine. And we were trying to do more and more. We were involved with sports clubs. Robert Nyrak, who was killed by the IRA, he worked in a boxing club up in sort of a hard area of North Belfast. He was involved in witchcraft with me as well. So, the Army's community relations efforts throughout the world, Malaya and Cyprus and Oman, everything else has been first class. The Army is very good at that. But that is actually an offshoot of PSYOPs. But what we have been focusing on largely, because of the nature of this story, is the dark, what was referred to as the darker side, where it is used as a weapon rather than as a cohesive factor.
But in terms of psychology as a kind of weapon to undermine people, as opposed to allow them to fill their own potentials. I mean, you don't have a problem with that idea?
No, I don't, because I think that you see, we're coming in. We've got two things to deal with. You have to deal with the people who are physically planting the bombs and firing the weapons. And those people are deliberately trying to kill you or to kill their fellow citizens. So there's a straight military situation there. And then there's that middle ground where there are people who don't support that violence at all. And that's the part of the community who ultimately are going to elect political representatives who, at the end of the day, are going to have to create that world when that violence ceases. So I think that there is what I would call it, avoid behaviour and approach behaviour, where by and large we wanted the community to approach us and talk to us and ask for help where it was relevant. But we also wanted to say that we will target people who are actually making your life very difficult and who have caused that loss of life and that damage that I've talked about before. So it's not stick and carrot, it's really opposite ends, but it's a matter of moving to the same objective. If you allow the paramilitaries to dominate an area, then you have really abdicated your responsibility to ensure that there is law and order. And of course the problem is that ordinary people then become terrorised by their own paramilitaries. You get racketeering and all of the things that happened in Northern Ireland. But what you have to do, it's a gradual process, is you have to gradually build up confidence between the community and you as part of the forces of law and order, and you have to make life as difficult as possible for the people who are breaking the law and trying to kill people. And this is again that scale of, sometimes the scale tilts one way, sometimes it tilts another. But the army's role is sitting in the middle, and it's got to deal with both of those. It can't just deal with one. It has to do them in tandem, otherwise it's not going to be truly effective.
There's something that I picked up from Fred Holroyd. He said often people that would become informers, they were involved in a kind of personal conflict. So was that a part of the reason for creating those conflicts?
Well, people give information for different reasons. Some people do it because genuinely they're motivated against violence and they try to do something about it. Some people do it because they want to get their own back on somebody who is a paramilitary person. Sometimes they do it because they're getting money. Some people do it because we put pressure on them to do it. And the culture of the informer in Ireland is a very, very sore issue. Going back in Irish history, informers are hated with a passion. And therefore, someone talks about an informer, someone else will talk about a source. And of course, by and large, paramilitary organisations will kill informants if they find out who they are. So it's highly charged, and when a person comes forward and offers the security forces information, then that person needs to be protected at all costs because they are running a huge risk and they're going through an emotional turmoil. Before they approach you, all sorts of things have happened in their mind, and they're really almost doing this as a last resort. They're being pushed for some reason emotionally to give you information, and you have to bear that in mind.
Do you think that you have to in some way lack empathy to do that kind of work, the more psychological kind of work and creating conflicts between people? Or do you think that it's more of a kind of a pragmatic thing where you're saying, well, it's for the greater good?
I think it's very difficult, and I think it varies from person to person. I probably found it more difficult because I grew up in an environment I was then working in, whereas my colleagues all came from other parts of the UK. And I spent on lots of occasions quite a bit of time thinking it through. And then sometimes when, as a group, we were discussing an action to take, I would say, I really need to step out of this because there's a big danger that I may influence you because of my background. So where my knowledge might be useful in a discussion, I may also have a particular feeling why I can't give you a really detached view. There will be an element of emotion in there, and that certainly happened on a number of occasions. That wasn't nothing big, but I just felt that it needed, and then that detached space so that other people could think it through without me speaking.
Was there a conflict between the civilian and army propagandists, between Mooney and the IRD and individuals from military intelligence?
I think there was quite a strong conflict between the Ministry of Defence in London and Northern Ireland. When it was agreed to implement the PSYOPs policy, it was clear it should have been driven by the Northern Ireland office, but it would appear that the Northern Ireland office didn't want to do it because A, they didn't have the expertise, and maybe for political reasons they didn't want to get involved. So fundamentally it fell to the army to take on the responsibility. But the Ministry of Defence was split on PSYOPs, so the Chief Public Relations Officer, he resented the existence of a PSYOPs unit located inside the Army Information Services corridor. And the difficulty he had was that he had no control over PSYOPs because it was directed by the Deputy Under-Secretary of State for the Army. But part of the problem was that he also needed to use the PSYOPs unit because his management sometimes wanted various themes circulated. So part of the difficulty we had, we were getting pulled in two directions, and then superimposed on top of the army structure, we had IRD and Hugh Mooney. And of course, he reported on a completely different reporting line to the Director in Control of Intelligence, and also back to his office in London. So the management side was difficult, and it was fraught because of internal politics more than anything else.
So when you say Hugh Mooney was on top of the PSYOPs, as in the Army Information Policy, does that mean that he could, in effect, act the way that he wanted and create his own campaigns without interference from the
Yes, Hugh Mooney basically had his own brief, and we weren't privy to that. Theoretically, he was supposed to be the PSYOPs advisor to the Army. That was in his brief. But the difficulty, of course, was that the resource was an Army one. So we had two colonels, plus myself, plus a major, and various other people. And it meant that a lot of the things that Hugh Mooney was doing of a political nature, the Army didn't want to do because it was political. And also because he didn't report to the Army, even though he had an Army cover title of Information Advisor to the GOC, he reported to his own boss. So it was very fraught. On a day-to-day basis, we got on fine as individuals, but the whole administration of that was difficult because we had different priorities. We had no real interest in politics per se, whereas he had quite a large interest in politics.
And how long before Clockwork Orange did Mooney leave?
Well, Hugh Mooney left Northern Ireland in December 1973, and Clockwork Orange started in January 1974. So, you know, it's not unreasonable to assume that those two things were linked, but I can't prove that.
And could you give a brief overview of the progression of Clockwork Orange? So it started with, you know, targeting the kind of sources of arms of paramilitary groups, and then it went on to targeting kind of politicians on the loyalist side, and then so.
Clockwork Orange started off targeting the IRA, and the very first thing we did was to create a fake story by allegedly a member of the IRA who was going to defect, who had become disillusioned by the IRA's campaign. He was going to defect, and he wanted to sell his story to a newspaper. And so there were two things. First of all, we wanted the IRA to believe that there was somebody in the ranks who was going to break cover and probably give a lot of information. and to show that there was dissatisfaction with the leadership. And of course, 1974, that was true because a lot of the IRA leaders were then in detention, and the quality of the leadership on the ground wasn't as good. So that was credible. And then we were building into this narrative lots of things that we wanted to, as it were, get across to the public about dissatisfaction inside the IRA. So that started up, and then it was purely targeted at the IRA. And then after that, we were doing some work on the Protestant paramilitaries, where they were actually using extortion to get money from local businesses and local people. So they were using their paramilitary muscle to get that money. And then it carried through with various themes, IRA getting finance from America, getting weapons from finance. And over the year, there were different themes added into the umbrella title.
Could you also detail the kind of targeting of the Protestant politicians through Clockwork Orange?
The second part of Clockwork Orange, after the IRA diary, then was targeted at loyalist paramilitaries. And it was at that stage that Tara and William McGrath, who was associated, of course, with the Concora scandal, that some of those loyalist paramilitaries came into play, because the difficulty that we had was that following the success of the Ulster Workers' Council strike, the loyalist paramilitary groups, and there were lots of them, had built up quite a large power base, and the success of that strike had given them a lot of strength in the loyalist communities. The problem was moving the government's initiative for any form of power sharing or dialogue was unlikely while the loyalist paramilitaries had that very strong grassroots support. And so part of the second phase of Clockwork Orange was to look at some of the more objectionable activities by those groups from the community point of view, their view, not ours, where people said that shopkeepers were being forced to give money for protection and so on and so forth.
But so this didn't involve, for instance, the kind of faked bank statement for Ian Paisley and things like that. That was not part of Clockwork Orange.
The fake bank statement relating to Paisley was, from my memory, late in 1973, because there was various issues coming out as far as the Democratic Unionist Party was concerned, and also at that stage there was the opposition by Paisley to the Sunningdale Agreement and power sharing. So he was a main, or one of the main people who was holding out any form of power sharing, and so some of the political material that went into PSYOPs at the end of '73 was targeted at Paisley and his supporters.
Could you describe the kind of initial meeting, the founding meeting of Clockwork Orange, and how you came to liaise with John Shaw, and who John Shaw was?
Well, at a meeting, and I think it was January or maybe even February, but more likely to be January 1974 at the Northern Ireland office, there was a discussion about the strategic use of information. And part of the discussion was about how we could share information that was relevant, campaigns between the Northern Ireland office, which was the British side of the Northern Ireland political scene rather than the local one. And that meeting was attended by a person who was then the senior intelligence officer in Northern Ireland. He was an MI5 officer. And the agreement from the meeting, or one of the main agreements, was that someone would liaise with intelligence at the Northern Ireland office and pass to the PSYOPs unit at Lisburn material that they felt was relevant to whatever activities we were doing. So in other words, they would feed through material as it came in, which we would then put into our system and then use with targets of opportunity. There was no decision actually who that person was going to be. Then I was later contacted by the NIO, had a further meeting, and they introduced me to this person. John Shaw, contrary to what people say, was not an official cover name for an MI5 officer. It was a name that he and I agreed. Indeed, it was the name of a journalist. Journalists tended to come into Northern Ireland for maybe 2-week stretches and then go back to England. And one reporter was called John Shaw from the Press Association. And the idea was that when I was out at my office, calls to my office were routed through the Army press desk. The idea would be that if John Shaw of MI5 rang up for me, instead of leaving his real name, whoever that was, he would say, "This is John Shaw," but then he would say, "I'm at the White Gables Hotel." And the White Gables Hotel was a restaurant pub near Army headquarters, a place called Hillsborough. I would know when the Army press people told me there'd been a call for me from John Shaw. I would know who it was. I knew it wasn't the journalist John Shaw. I would know it was my contact. But then, as far as the press desk were concerned, John Shaw was, a journalist that was known to them. So it was a good cover.
Could you explain during these meetings at the White Gable Hotel, what kind of information did John Shaw provide you with?
Oh, from memory, it's quite a cross-section, because initially a lot of the material followed the Clockwork Orange theme, which was about Protestant racketeering, for example, after we'd covered the initial IRA defector story. So they weren't bringing in, and John Shaw wasn't bringing in anything that was particularly new. It was fitting a pattern of themes that we had already agreed we were looking at. And the idea was he was just literally ensuring that material that was of relevance to what I was doing was just copied across to me. It was as simple as that. It was only later on in that year, probably about the time of the Ulster Workers' Council strike, which was in May, that a lot of the material became more political. And it became political, I think, for two reasons. First of all, the fact that the government were pushing forward with a Council of Ireland, where the Irish Republic would have a say in Northern Ireland affairs. And I think also because the policies being put forward by Harold Wilson's government, for example, the release of detainees, and the knowledge that Harold Wilson had advocated withdrawal from Northern Ireland at an earlier stage, there was a great deal of concern about really where the government were going. And then finally there were some lower policies. For example, the Labour government were saying that we shouldn't carry out hot pursuit unless authorised by the Secretary of State's office. This meant that if a soldier was shot at from, say, somewhere and he disappeared into a house, we couldn't immediately chase after them. We would have to wait until we got authority from the Northern Ireland office. Now, those things are probably seen as pretty minor, but it was against a climate where the Ulster Constabulary and the UDR were feeling more and more marginalised because of this incoming Labour government. And there were rumours that the UDR and the RUC might even go on strike at one point. And so there was a considerable amount of unease, and part of the Army PSYOP's role was to, particularly my role with the Ulster Defence Regiment, was to sort of keep a finger on the morale pulse of what the local security forces were doing. And then of course the Ulster Workers' Council strike made that situation even worse, because the power sharing assembly as such collapsed as a result of that strike. When that happened, we were told that Harold Wilson was incensed because the strike wasn't handled very well in Northern Ireland, and he then sent in a journalist who he recruited specially as a PR advisor to head up all government information, including the Army, and that created a lot of disquiet between the army and the police and the Northern Ireland office, because this person was seen as someone who was in Harold Wilson's pocket and therefore was implementing or trying to push through policies that were contrary to what fundamentally the population and the security forces wanted to implement. So that's a simplistic view of it, but those were some of the undercurrents that we were trying to deal with from the middle of '74 onwards.
And at what point did you receive information on, UK politicians, both on the left and the right? I mean, you said, was this simply to use as examples, or?
Yes, I was getting information, I think, probably from round about the time of the Dublin bombings, which would have been in May '74 onwards. My feeling about that was that the first election, which brought Harold Wilson to power, was in February. He then was in a minority government, and it was quite clear that there was going to have to be another election before the end of the year, or it was likely to be. And I think some of the information then that was coming in was with bearing that in mind, that a lot of issues dealing with security in Northern Ireland were going to be very contentious and would become an issue in the next election. And so I think some of the information I was being given to feed into the material I was producing was designed to colour public opinion that the Wilson government was not acting in the best interests of Northern Ireland. I think that was the general tone of what was happening.
For instance, a letter that Merlin Rees received from an IRA supporters organisation, or purported IRA supporters organisation in the United States. Were you involved in the drafting of that letter, or were you only involved in kind of bringing it to the attention of journalists?
Quite a lot of documents were supplied during 1973-74, really, I suppose, highlighting communism involved in Ireland, or links between the IRA and various politicians and political groups in England. Most of the ones that I had came through the IRD. The material I got in '74 from John Cho, I tended to compile notes from that, but in September or the beginning of October 1974, I returned all the actual material that I got from him. I gave that back to him. You see, one of the things we did, that material given to us was either unattributable, it had no markings on it, so there weren't letterheads or anything else, because that information was designed to be leaked in a way that it couldn't be attributed back to security forces. And quite often I would put material into my system, but then I would have built that into briefing papers, and then those briefing papers I would have used should a suitable opportunity arise. But if that paper happened to fall into the hands of someone else, it can never be traced back to the army or to the intelligence services.
In terms of your Clockwork Orange notes relating to the Wilson, Harold Wilson and the Labour government, why do you think you were given that information? Considering the sensitivity of it, I mean, why would, even if they were only examples, why would John Shaw have given you that information? Because you, as far as I understand, you were not asked to write, to spread any propaganda about Harold Wilson.
No, say this was background, because if we're looking at, for example, the increase in violence and the bombing of Dublin in May 1974, that has to be put in context, particularly if you're briefing journalists in depth or foreign journalists. So you have to explain at that stage what led up to the violence, and that was really the Sunningdale Agreement and the fact of power sharing and the Council of Ireland. But you also had to talk about government policy, and government policy involved things like the release of detainees and all the issues that we have mentioned that were very contentious in Ireland. But nevertheless, the problem with the material that I was getting was much more specific about individuals. So while the background of the voting patterns and all of those things, who was like to be elected in Ireland, how that was likely to change Northern Ireland politics, that's one thing. But when you begin to then look at specific members of the Labour Party or the Labour government, and you attribute to them certain alliances that they may or may not have had with the IRA or with left-wing organisations, my feeling was you crossed the line from dealing with what I would call paramilitary activity into political activity. And the difficulty is, at what point does the individual himself or herself cross that line? When does a politician who is openly supporting the IRA cross the line between being a democratically elected politician and being someone supporting a terrorist organisation? And that's a very difficult choice to make. And my view was, by the middle of September, that that's not something that we should be doing, because it's not an army function. First of all, the army really didn't collect political information on people. It was dealing purely with hard terrorism. Yes, in Ireland there were people on the fringes of terrorist movement where we did certainly keep an eye on them. But I think in the wider election, particularly dealing with Northern Ireland, that was the case. And some of the people who also featured in it weren't just Labour Party people, there were also Conservatives and Liberals as well in that mix. So on the one hand you could say, well, the information is legitimate if you're explaining the political context, but on the other hand you have to say, was it right, wise, that that should be built in a way that tends to slant the support they may be given to an organisation that's on the fringes of terrorism, if not involved in terrorism?